If you pulled into a gas station today and expected someone to come out and pump your gas, check your oil, and wash your windshield, you'd be standing there a long time. Full-service gas stations, once found on virtually every commercial strip in America, have almost completely disappeared. The reason is structural. Self-service pumps cost less to operate, and the car itself stopped needing what the attendant provided. But that wasn't always the case. For most of the 20th century, you never touched a gas pump. You pulled in, a bell rang, and a man in a branded uniform walked out to handle everything: the fuel, the windshield, the dipstick, the tire pressure, a 5-minute ritual, twice a week, that 216,000 stations performed for virtually every driving household in the country. This is the story of how that world worked, what dismantled it, and what disappeared along with it. Chapter 1. The ding-ding. You didn't think about it. That was the point. You pulled into a station, Texaco, Gulf, Esso, Mobil, Sinclair, with the green dinosaur on the sign, Phillips 66 with the orange shield, and the front tires rolled over a rubber air hose stretched across the concrete apron. Inside the office, a pneumatic bell rang. Ding-ding. Not a chime, not a buzzer. A specific pressurized ding-ding that anyone who grew up before 1980 can still hear if they close their eyes. An attendant came out, sometimes fast, sometimes at a walk, depending on how many cars were already on the island. He wore a uniform, branded, with the oil company's name or logo on the chest. At Texaco, the uniform included a bow tie and a red star. At most stations, it was a cap, a button-down shirt with the company patch and work pants. The uniform mattered. It signaled that this wasn't a random kid with a rag. This was the oil company's representative standing between you and your car. He'd lean toward the window. Fill it up? Most of the time, yes. Regular or ethyl. That was the only question. He'd unlatch the nozzle, start the pump, and then the routine kicked in. While the tank filled, he pulled a squeegee from the bucket mounted on the pump island, washed the windshield front and back, sometimes the headlights. Then the hood came up. He pulled the dipstick, wiped it, reinserted it, pulled it again, and read the oil level. If you were a quart low, he'd tell you. He checked the radiator. He might check battery water. This was an era when batteries needed water topped off regularly. He'd eyeball the tires, and if one looked soft, he'd crouch down with a pencil gauge and read the pressure. A typical fill-up took 5 to 7 minutes. You never left the car. You never touched the pump. When it was done, he'd come back to the window, tell you the total, $3, maybe $4 for a full tank in the early 1960s, and often hand you something, a road map, a drinking glass with the station's logo, maybe S&H green stamps you'd paste into a booklet, and eventually redeem for a toaster or a set of dishes. The transaction was not just fuel. It was a small, recurring service ritual that happened once or twice a week for virtually every car-owning household in America. And here's the thing most people under 50 don't realize. The gasoline was almost beside the point. Chapter 2. The real business. Behind the pump gas stations didn't make money on gas, not real money. The pump was the loss leader, the thing that brought the car onto the lot. The margin on a gallon of gasoline in the 1950s and 60s was a few cents, and the oil company took most of it. What kept the station alive was everything else. The service bays were the engine of the business. Behind or beside the pump island, most stations had 1, 2, or 3 bays where mechanics did the work that cars of that era constantly required. Tune-ups, brake jobs, muffler replacements, points and plugs, carburetors that needed cleaning and adjustment every 15 to 20,000 miles. This was the high-margin work, and it came in steady because mid-century American cars were, by modern standards, gloriously high maintenance. Oil changes happened every 1,000 miles, not because people were cautious, but because the oil broke down that fast. Coolant systems leaked, fan belts cracked, distributors needed adjustment. The car brought you back. Then there was TBA, tires, batteries, and accessories, a station that sold Goodyear or Firestone tires, stocked batteries, and carried fan belts, hoses, and wiper blades, had a product line that generated disproportionate profit relative to its modest share of volume. Motor oil alone, according to American Planning Association data from the 1960s, typically ran at about 5% of gasoline profit on under 3% of gasoline volume. A station owner who pumped gas, ran 2 service bays, and sold tires could survive on pump margins of a few cents a gallon because those cents were never the point. They were the foot traffic. The architecture told the story. Stations evolved from 1920s, house with canopy designs meant to blend into residential neighborhoods, to the streamlined modern boxes of the 1930s and 40s. Walter Darwin Teague's white enamel Texaco prototype of 1937 was the archetype, replicated at hundreds of stations across the country, to the larger canopied layouts of the post-war highway boom. By the mid-1960s, the vocabulary was set. A pump island up front, an office with a plate glass window, service bays in back, and a sign tall enough to catch the eye from the road. Esso's Blue Oval, Gulf's Orange Disc, Mobil's Red Pegasus, Sinclair's Dino. Each one a landmark you could navigate by. The station owner, usually a franchisee, not a company employee, sat at the center of all of it. He paid rent to the oil company, bought fuel on a branded supply contract, and operated the bays and the retail counter as his own business. The arrangement gave the oil majors enormous reach without the cost of managing individual locations. It gave the owner a business with built-in foot traffic and brand recognition. And it gave the neighborhood a place that was open 12 or 14 hours a day, staffed by people who knew your car and often knew your name. That arrangement had a flaw in it, but it would take a decade of oil shocks and a few $100 billion of corporate strategy to expose it. Chapter 3. The First Job. For a generation of American teenagers, the gas station was the entry point, not an internship, not a resume builder, a job. You showed up, you pumped gas, you learned to check oil, read a tire gauge, top off coolant, and talk to adults who were trusting you with their car. The pay was modest. The federal minimum wage was $1.60 an hour in 1968, about $14.80 in today's money. But the job taught a specific set of things that no classroom offered: basic mechanical literacy, customer interaction, the rhythm of physical work that started when the bell rang and didn't stop until the apron was empty. At a busy station, an attendant might service 40 or 50 cars in an 8-hour shift. Each one followed the same sequence: greet, pump, wash, check, collect, thank. The repetition built speed and confidence. A teenager who'd been pumping gas for 6 months could diagnose a slow leak by the sound of a tire, spot a radiator hose about to fail, or tell from the color of the oil on the dipstick whether a car was burning it. None of that was taught. It was absorbed the way any trade skill is absorbed, by doing it hundreds of times under the eye of someone who'd done it thousands. And it was everywhere. In towns with 2 stoplights, the gas station was often the first employer a teenager encountered outside of family. In cities, stations clustered along commercial strips, and the competition for attendant jobs among high school kids was genuine. The job wasn't glamorous. It smelled like gasoline. Your hands were perpetually stained, and winter shifts meant standing on a frozen pump island in wind that cut through the branded jacket. But it was real work, with real money, and it introduced millions of young Americans to the basic mechanics of the machine that would define their adult lives. That labor force was about to become an expense the industry couldn't justify. But in 1965, at the peak, nobody inside those stations knew it. Chapter 4. The Geography of the Pump. The full-service station occupied a peculiar place in America's racial geography, and understanding that geography matters because it reveals who the service economy actually served and who it excluded. For black motorists traveling through the Jim Crow South and through plenty of the North, the gas station was not a neutral space. Most stations were white-owned and white-operated, and many refused service to black customers or allowed them to buy gas but denied them access to the restroom. The road trip for black families required planning that white families never had to think about. Where can we stop? Where can we eat? Where is it safe? One oil company broke the pattern, at least partially. Esso, Standard Oil of New Jersey, later Exxon, franchised stations to African American operators at a rate no other major matched. By some counts, over a third of Esso's stations were black-owned or black-operated, and under a sponsorship arrangement with Standard Oil, Esso stations sold Victor Hugo Green's Negro Motorist Green Book, a pocket-sized guide published annually from 1936 to 1966 listing hotels, restaurants, beauty shops, and gas stations where black travelers would be welcomed. At its peak, the Green Book distributed roughly 15,000 copies a year through Esso stations alone, with some estimates putting annual distribution as high as 2 million copies by the early 1960s, when Allied businesses and subscription sales were included. The Green Book's final edition appeared in 1966, 2 years after the Civil Rights Act made its explicit purpose legally unnecessary, if not yet socially obsolete. Its disappearance tracked the end of one era. The full-service station's disappearance would track the end of another. Both vanished not because the need went away, but because the systems around them changed faster than the institutions could adapt. By 1972, the American gas station had reached its numerical peak, 216,000 stations, dense with name brands, staffed by uniformed attendants, anchored by service bays, and woven into the daily routine of virtually every driving household in the country. The economics worked. The culture was stable. The routine was so ordinary it was invisible. Then October came. Chapter 5. When October came. On October 17, 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an oil embargo against the United States. The retail price of regular gasoline jumped 43%, from 38.5 cents in May 1973 to 55.1 cents by June 1974. Crude oil went from roughly $3 a barrel to nearly $12. By the last week of February 1974, the American Automobile Association reported that 20% of U.S. gas stations had no fuel at all. States improvised. New Jersey posted green, yellow, and red flags at stations to signal supply levels and imposed odd-even rationing based on license plate numbers. Nixon pushed a national version of the same rule, signed a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit into law, and asked stations to close on Sundays. Lines stretched around blocks. Drivers topped off half-full tanks out of panic, which made the shortage worse. And for the first time, millions of Americans were willing to do something that fire codes in most states had previously banned: pump their own gas if it meant getting to the front of the line 5 minutes faster. That behavioral shift, born of panic, not preference, turned out to be permanent. The second shock came in 1979. The Iranian Revolution knocked Iranian oil off the world market. Crude doubled to nearly $40 a barrel, and gasoline crossed $1 for the first time. Stations had to replace their mechanical pump dials because the hardware topped out at 99.9 cents. In Levittown, Pennsylvania, frustrated drivers rioted, overturned cars, and set fires. The inflation-adjusted peak came in 1981, $1.35 at the pump, which translates to roughly $4.85 in today's dollars, higher than anything Americans had seen since the First World War. But the prices weren't what killed the full-service station. 3 downstream consequences did. First, the panic-buying lines normalized self-service pumping as a mass behavior. Once people had done it, once the mystique of the gasoline nozzle was broken, the willingness to do it again came easily, especially if it saved 3 or 4 cents a gallon. Second, Congress passed federal fuel economy standards in 1975, the CAFE rules, and consumers pivoted hard toward Japanese imports. Average U.S. vehicle fuel economy rose 81% between 1975 and 1988. Americans were burning less gas per car. The gallon market was shrinking. Third, the legal scaffolding changed. The Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act of 1973 and the Petroleum Marketing Practices Act of 1978 reshaped the relationship between oil companies and their franchise dealers. Dealers won new protections against arbitrary termination, a real victory in the moment. But the laws also signaled something the dealers didn't fully appreciate. The oil majors were already calculating whether retail was worth the headache. The protections that shielded dealers from being cut loose also made the majors less interested in having dealers at all. Those 3 forces, a public willing to pump its own gas, cars that needed less of it, and an oil industry rethinking whether it wanted to be in the service station business, converged over the next decade. The 1970s didn't invent the decline. They broke the social contract that had held the system together. Chapter 6. Self-service was already waiting. The conventional story that self-service pumps were an innovation born from the oil crisis is wrong by 26 years. Frank Urich opened the first modern self-service station at the corner of Gilson and Atlantic in Los Angeles in 1947. His slogan was blunt: save 5 cents, serve yourself, why pay more? He sold more than 500,000 gallons in his first month. Gilmore Oil's Gasateria followed in 1948. What kept self-service from spreading wasn't consumer resistance, it was law. State fire codes and dealer protection statutes banned or restricted self-service in most of the country. Indiana outlawed it in 1930 at the urging of incumbent competitors who didn't want to be undercut. By 1948, 9 states had similar bans. As late as 1968, only 27 states allowed self-service at all. The Fire Marshals Association of America withdrew its safety objection in 1969. By 1970, there were 4,600 self-service pumps operating in 33 states. Then the embargo hit and the dam broke. Between 1975 and 1977, the self-service share of U.S. gasoline sales doubled from about 15% to 30%. In 1978, it crossed 50%. The first year self-service outsold full service nationally. Kansas and Dallas legalized in 1972. Los Angeles and much of the Midwest in 1973, Florida in 1974, Illinois in 1976, North Dakota in 1977. The economics were simple and merciless. A full-service island required at least 1 attendant per shift, sometimes 2 at a busy station. A self-service island required a single cashier behind glass who could monitor 8 or 10 pumps simultaneously. The labor savings were immediate and obvious, and the car itself was quietly undermining the attendant's usefulness. Delco introduced the maintenance-free sealed battery in 1971. No more checking battery water. Radial tires replaced bias ply, longer lasting, less likely to lose pressure. Electronic ignition and fuel injection eliminated the carburetor adjustments that had kept service bays busy. Manufacturer-recommended oil change intervals stretched from 1,000 miles to 3,000, and eventually to 7,500 or more. The attendant who checked your oil and battery water every Tuesday was no longer solving a real problem. He was performing a ritual whose mechanical justification had quietly disappeared. By 1980, only Oregon and New Jersey still banned self-service statewide. The other 48 states had decided, through a combination of legislation and market pressure, that the American driver could handle a gas nozzle. The full-service station didn't vanish overnight. Thousands persisted through the 1980s, especially in suburbs and small towns where the owner knew his customers, and the service bays still paid the bills. But the trajectory was set. The island attendant, the windshield squeegee, the ding-ding of the driveway bell, all of it was receding, and then the ground itself turned into a liability. Chapter 7. The Regulation That Closed. Thousands of stations. If the 1970s killed full service, the late 1980s killed the small independent station, and the weapon wasn't market competition. It was environmental law, justified, necessary, and devastating to operators who couldn't afford to comply. Under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act's Subtitle 1, passed in 1984, and the EPA's 1988 technical regulations that followed, every owner of an underground storage tank installed before December 1988 had, until December 22, 1998, to retrofit corrosion protection, spill and overfill prevention, and leak detection, or permanently close. Most tanks at the time were bare steel, buried decades earlier with no lining, no monitoring, and no protection against the slow seepage that had been contaminating groundwater at thousands of sites across the country. The costs, by the EPA's own 1997 estimates, were staggering for a small operator. Leak detection alone ran $3,000 to $8,000. Cathodic protection retrofits cost $10,000 to $48,000. Installing 3 new 10,000-gallon tanks with modern containment ran $76,000 to $100,000. And if contamination was already present, and at thousands of sites it was, cleanup could exceed $225,000. When the underground storage tank program began, there were roughly 2.1 million regulated tanks in the United States. Today, about 535,000 remain active. That number tells the story more efficiently than any policy analysis. The regulation functioned as a one-way filter. Stations with deep-pocketed corporate parents upgraded. Stations owned by a 60-year-old independent who'd been pumping gas since the Eisenhower administration looked at a $100,000 compliance bill, looked at pump margins of 3 to 5 cents a gallon, and closed. The 1986 Leaking Underground Storage Tank Trust Fund, financed by a per-gallon tax, paid for cleanup at tens of thousands of sites, but it didn't pay for upgrades. The mom-and-pop station that couldn't afford new tanks became a brownfield site, eventually swept up under the 2002 Small Business Liability Relief and Brownfields Revitalization Act. The numbers are stark. The period from 1994 to 2013 alone saw the count of U.S. retail fueling sites fall from 202,800 to roughly 153,000, a 25% decline in 2 decades. Manhattan lost a third of its stations between 2004 and 2014 as real estate math overwhelmed gasoline economics. Across the country, the stations that survived were increasingly not the places your father had taken his car to on Saturdays. They were corporate-owned, recently built, and attached to something else entirely. Chapter 8. Big Oil Walks Away. On June 12, 2008, ExxonMobil made it official. The company announced it would sell all 820 of its remaining company-owned stations and divest 1,400 dealer-operated sites over a multi-year period that was essentially complete by 2012. Spokesman Prem Nair cited margin pressure from hypermarkets. The underlying logic was simpler. Even with gasoline at $4 a gallon, retail wasn't profitable enough for a company earning $41 billion a year. The return on capital was negligible. The liability exposure was real. The brand value of having your name on a canopy was no longer worth what it cost to keep the canopy lit. ExxonMobil wasn't first. Shell, BP, ConocoPhillips, and Chevron had all been quietly shedding retail stations for years. But the ExxonMobil announcement was the clearest signal that an era was over. By 2014, the top 5 oil companies collectively owned just 0.4% of U.S. gas stations, down from 1.9% in 2008. The tiger was still on the canopy. The Pegasus was still on the sign. But the company behind the logo had walked away from the relationship with the driver that had built those brands in the first place. The franchise protections that dealers had won in 1978 now governed relationships that the oil majors themselves wanted no part of. What replaced the oil company station was the convenience store with pumps. According to the National Association of Convenience Stores, C-stores now sell roughly 80% of U.S. motor fuel, up from 59% in 1997. About 122,000 convenience stores dispense gasoline nationwide, and 63% of those are owned by operators with 10 or fewer locations. 7-Eleven began offering self-service gas in the late 1960s. Wawa sold gas briefly in the 1970s, exited, and returned in 1996. Sheetz, Quick Trip, Racetrack, Buc-ee's. Entire brands built around the food plus fuel model, where the gasoline exists to get you into the parking lot and the coffee, the hoagies, and the made-to-order burritos pay the bills. On the hypermarket side, the logic was even more naked. Costco opened its first gas station in 2006, and today derives roughly 10% of its sales, about $20 billion, from fuel, sold at margins approaching zero to drive warehouse membership traffic. Sam's Club, Kroger, and Walmart followed the same playbook. If your margin on gasoline was already 3 to 5 cents a gallon, you could not survive against a competitor whose margin was zero. The hypermarket didn't need to make money on gas. It needed you inside the building, pushing a flatbed cart past the rotisserie chickens. The full-service station's business model, gas as traffic driver for service bays and TBA, had been replaced by a new version of the same idea, except the service bays were gone, the attendants were gone, the TBA was gone, and the thing inside the building was a convenience store selling fountain drinks and lottery tickets. Chapter 9. The last holdouts. Only 2 states resisted the self-service wave entirely. Their stories reveal less about gasoline than about the politics of convenience. New Jersey's ban dates to 1949, and it began with a price war. A Hackensack station operator named Irving Reingold cut his prices from 22 cents to 18.9 cents a gallon by letting customers pump their own gas. When local competitors couldn't match him, and when intimidation, including gunfire at his station, failed to shut him down, The Gasoline Retailers Association went to the legislature. The Retail Gasoline Dispensing Safety Act passed on safety grounds, fire risk, fume exposure, the danger of untrained civilians handling volatile liquids. The actual motivation was dealer protection, and everybody knew it. Oregon followed in 1951 with similar reasoning. The safety arguments, fire, benzene exposure, the difficulty of enforcing no smoking rules at the pump, were never strongly supported by data. Roughly 4% of gas station fires begin with gasoline igniting, according to research cited in published analyses. But the laws proved politically durable because voters liked the service. A 1982 Oregon ballot measure to repeal the ban failed with nearly 58% voting to keep attendance. Oregon didn't fully relent until 2023, when a new law allowed up to half the pumps at any station to go self-service, while preserving a full-service option during daytime hours. New Jersey remains the last full-service-only state. About 1,900 gas stations and 10,000 attendants operate under the 1949 law as of 2025. A 2025 bill to legalize self-service drew immediate constituent backlash and remains in committee. Polling is remarkably consistent. 73% of New Jerseyans say they don't want to pump their own gas, and 60% oppose eliminating the full-service mandate outright. Even among those who'd accept self-service as an option, the majority want full service to remain available. That number, 73%, is the most revealing statistic in this entire story. It tells you that when Americans still have the experience, they prefer it. The full-service station didn't disappear because drivers wanted it gone. It disappeared because the economics shifted underneath it, and nobody asked the drivers until it was too late. Chapter 10. What went with the squeegee? The disappearance of the full-service station produced consequences that go well beyond the pump island. Some are measurable, some aren't. Both kinds matter. Start with tires. A trained attendant with a pencil gauge caught under inflation as part of a routine that took 30 seconds and cost the driver nothing. Without that routine, underinflation became endemic. NHTSA survey data from 2010 found that 23.1% of vehicles without tire pressure monitoring systems had at least one tire severely underinflated. The federal response was not to bring back the attendant. It was to mandate tire pressure monitoring systems on all vehicles starting with the 2008 model year, a technological substitution for a human ritual. NHTSA estimates the sensors reduce severe underinflation by 56%. That means they're better than nothing and worse than the guy who checked every Tuesday. The oil check culture vanished with the attendant. Modern cars don't burn oil the way a 1968 Impala did, so the stakes are lower, but they're not zero. Coolant systems, wiper fluid, belt condition, the visual inspection a practiced eye performed in 30 seconds while the tank filled, all of that moved from someone else's responsibility to the driver's, and the driver mostly doesn't do it. Preventive maintenance became something that happened at 10,000-mile intervals at a dealership, not twice a week at a pump island. The teenage job disappeared. Pumping gas was once a canonical American first job, memorialized in American graffiti, assumed in 1,000 coming-of-age stories. It taught basic mechanical literacy, customer service, and the discipline of repetitive physical work. What replaced it was the convenience store cashier position, indoors, climate-controlled, and involving no contact with the car whatsoever. The replacement job isn't worse in every way, but it teaches different things, and basic automotive knowledge isn't one of them. For women driving alone at night, the staffed pump island provided a layer of safety that the empty self-service lot does not. For disabled drivers, full service was automatic accommodation. The Americans with Disabilities Act and a patchwork of state rules now require stations to provide attendant assistance on request, but enforcement is erratic, and the experience of pressing a call button and waiting, if anyone comes at all, is a different thing entirely from pulling up to a station where someone walks out before you've turned off the engine. And then there's the thing that's hardest to quantify. For most of the 20th century, someone whose job it was looked at your car twice a week, not a mechanic doing a scheduled service, an attendant doing a 30-second visual and tactile check, oil, coolant, tire pressure, windshield, battery. It wasn't comprehensive, it wasn't diagnostic, but it caught things. It caught the slow leak, the low oil, the cracked hose, the wiper blade that had turned to rubber strips. It was a distributed, informal, continuous maintenance system embedded in the act of buying gasoline. When the attendant disappeared, that system disappeared with him. Nothing replaced it except dashboard warning lights and the driver's own attention, which, as anyone who has driven behind a car with a brake light out can confirm, is not a reliable substitute. Chapter 11. The Sound of the Bell. Culturally, the full-service gas station has completed the journey from utility to memory. Edward Hopper painted it in 1940. Gas, 3 pumps, and an attendant at dusk, the light failing, the road disappearing into trees. Ed Ruscha photographed 26 of them in 1963, straight on, deadpan, before either artist could have known they were documenting something that wouldn't last. Route 66 preservationists now restore Phillips. 66 cottages and Texaco boxes as tourist attractions. The Petroliana collector market, vintage pump globes, porcelain signs, visible register pumps, thrives on the same impulse that keeps 73% of New Jerseyans loyal to a law passed in 1949. The thing is gone. The memory of the thing is not. The full-service gas station was not killed by a single villain or a single year. Self-service was legal in California 2 decades before it was popular, which means the oil shocks didn't invent the trend. They accelerated a latent one. Environmental regulation closed the weakest operators. Corporate strategy ended direct ownership by the majors. Retail evolution turned the station into a convenience store. And the car itself, sealed batteries, radial tires, fuel injection, tire pressure sensors, eliminated the maintenance rituals that once gave the attendant a reason to exist. The result is a system that delivers gasoline more cheaply and, from a groundwater perspective, more safely than the 1965 service station ever did. That's worth acknowledging. But it has almost nothing in common with what it replaced. The oil company that built the brand is gone from the canopy. The mechanic is gone from the bay. The teenager learning what a dipstick does is gone from the island. The driver sits in a concrete lot under fluorescent light, holding a nozzle in one hand and a phone in the other, and nobody checks anything. The ding-ding of the driveway bell, when you hear it in a restored garage, or in a movie set in 1962, or in the memory of anyone who grew up before it stopped, is the sound of an entire labor economy, social contract, and architectural form that quietly left American life. Not because anyone voted it out, not because the technology failed, because one force at a time the math changed, and when the math changes, the bell eventually stops ringing. If that bell brought something back for you, a station you remember, an attendant who knew your car, a first job on the Pump Island, I'd appreciate hearing about it. And if you found this worth your time, subscribing helps me know there's interest in these kinds of stories.